In 2008, in the port city of Tianjin, Airbus did something it had never done before. It opened a final assembly line for the A320, its best-selling jet, outside Europe for the very first time, on Chinese soil. Built by Chinese workers. That same year, a few hundred miles away, the Chinese government authorized a state-owned company to build a single-aisle jet of its own, one that would look remarkably like the aircraft now rolling off that Airbus line. The original and the copy would grow up in the same country. At the same time, one of them would go on to conquer the world. The other has never entered commercial service outside China. For 4 decades, commercial aviation has run on a settled fact. 2 companies build the world's single-aisle jets, Boeing and Airbus. Between them, roughly 90% of the market. It's the most valuable duopoly in transportation, and China has spent the better part of 20 years and tens of billions of dollars trying to become the third by building an aircraft that borrows heavily from the jet Airbus was already assembling in Tianjin. This is the COMAC C919, China's answer to the A320. On paper, it should be selling. There is a global aircraft shortage. If you order an A320neo or a 737 MAX today, you could wait the better part of a decade for delivery. Airlines are desperate for narrow bodies. The C919 is cheaper than both Western rivals, and it holds an order book of over 1,000 aircraft. But here's what makes no sense. By early 2026, after nearly 2 decades of development, COMAC had delivered only a few dozen C919 aircrafts, fewer than 40 in the entire history of the program, and not a single one has gone to an airline outside China. The reason why reveals how commercial aviation actually works. To understand why the C919 is stuck, you first have to understand what it's up against and why that duopoly is so hard to break. The Airbus A320 first flew in 1987, the Boeing 737 in a much earlier form in 1967. These are not new aircraft. Their fundamental architectures are, in engineering terms, ancient, and yet they dominate. Because in commercial aviation, age is an asset. Every one of those decades produced flight hours. Millions of them. Every hardware fault, every software edge case, every maintenance quirk has been found, documented, and fixed. When an airline buys an A320, it isn't buying a design, it's buying 40 years of accumulated reliability. Around each aircraft sits an invisible machine that matters more than the aircraft itself. A global support network, spare parts depots on every continent, certified maintenance facilities in almost every major country, trained mechanics, pilots already rated on the type, financing structures, insurance models, resale markets. This is where the real money lives. Airlines spend roughly 10 to 15% of their entire operating budget on maintenance and repair. A grounded aircraft earns nothing. So when a carrier chooses a jet, it isn't really choosing metal, it's choosing certainty, the confidence that a broken part in Lagos or Lima can be replaced within hours, not weeks. And then there's certification. Before an aircraft can carry passengers, it must be approved by a regulator. 2 matter above all others: the FAA in the United States and EASA in Europe. Most of the world's aviation authorities simply follow their lead, win FAA or EASA approval, and you can fly almost anywhere. Without it, you can't fly into the markets that generate the most revenue. Boeing and Airbus each roll out more than 1 finished aircraft every single day. They hold order backlogs measured in the thousands. Airbus has over 11,000 A320 family aircraft in service, accumulating hundreds of millions of flight hours. They are certified everywhere that matters, supported everywhere that matters, and financed everywhere that matters. That is the rule. That is what any challenger has to beat. Not a plane, an ecosystem. And China's answer to that ecosystem was to start with the one part it could copy, the aircraft itself. Look at the 2 aircraft side by side, the C919 and the A320, the same basic silhouette, the same single-aisle cabin cross-section, engines slung under the wings in the same place. A glass cockpit with a layout that looks deeply familiar. French business magazines like Capital have spent years documenting the resemblance, cockpit, cabin, systems, and the conclusion they keep reaching is blunt. This is not a coincidence, and there's a reason the resemblance runs so deep. For years, one story in particular has circulated circulated in European aerospace circles. In the early 2000s, according to former Airbus executive Patrick Deveau, one of the first A320s sold to China quietly disappeared, no commercial flights, no routing records, and was allegedly dismantled component by component so its structure could be studied and copied. A ghost plane. Now, be precise about this. That specific claim has never been substantiated. No court filing, no Airbus statement, no regulator record. It lives in documentaries and on forums more than in the evidence. So treat the ghost plane itself as folklore. But the reason it stuck is that the underlying pattern is documented, and it goes right to the heart of the C919. In 2018, a senior officer in China's Ministry of State Security, Yanjun, was arrested in Belgium and extradited to the United States, the first Chinese intelligence official ever extradited to stand trial. His target, advanced turbofan technology from GE Aviation, a core supplier to the very engine the C919 would fly on. In 2022, he was sentenced to 20 years in a federal prison in Ohio. So the espionage isn't rumor, it's a conviction. Copying isn't a slur invented by China's rivals, it's a method with a paper trail. And in the case of the A320, China didn't even have to go looking very far, because Airbus was building the real thing inside China, in Tianjin, from 2008 onwards. The original and the imitation were assembled in the same country at the same time, which brings us to the aircraft itself. The C919 program was authorized in 2008, run by a state-owned enterprise, the Commercial Aircraft Corporation of China, COMAC, a single-aisle jet, seating up to around 190 passengers, directly in the A320 and 737 seat class. First flight came in 2017. Commercial service began in May 2023, China Eastern flying Shanghai to Beijing. On the surface, mission accomplished. China copied the shape of an A320 and built a modern airliner that flies real passengers every day. But here's the trap. You can copy what an aircraft looks like. You cannot copy what makes it work. And the moment you measure the C919 against the jet it imitates, that gap opens up, starting with something as basic as its weight. A commercial aircraft lives and dies by a single, merciless equation: weight against range against payload. Every kilogram of structure has to be carried by fuel. Every kilogram of fuel is a kilogram you can't sell as passengers or cargo. And every passenger you remove to make the numbers work erodes the economics of the route. Shave weight and the whole equation improves. Add it, and everything gets worse at once. In aviation, small differences in weight compound over thousands of flights. The C919 was built primarily from aluminium alloys. Its maximum zero fuel weight sits around 64,600 kilograms. The A320neo comes in near 62,900. That's a penalty of roughly 1,700 kilograms, the better part of 2 tons of extra weight that must be lifted on every single flight. 2 tons sounds abstract. It isn't. At standard airline weights, that's dozens of passengers worth of dead mass carried on every departure for the life of the aircraft. The consequences cascade. The standard C919 achieves a range of around 4,000 kilometers. The A320neo reaches around 6,300. Even the extended range C919 tops out near 5,500, still short of what the A320neo does in its baseline form. Now sit with how strange that is. The C919 is a clean sheet 21st century design. The A320's bones are from the 1980s. By every intuition, the newer aircraft should win. It doesn't. And the reason isn't the design team, it's the supply chain, because the C919, marketed as a symbol of Chinese self-reliance, is in a very real sense a Western aircraft assembled in Shanghai. The engines, the CFM LEAP 1C, come from a joint venture between America's GE Aerospace and France's Safran. Flight controls, avionics, hydraulics, landing gear, American and European suppliers over and over again. And here's the catch that hurts most. Because of that documented history of reverse engineering and espionage, many of those Western suppliers will not hand China their newest technology. While the LEAP 1C shares technology with other LEAP engines, export controls and intellectual property concerns have limited China's access to the latest propulsion technologies. It is closer in some respects to the older CFM56 architecture from the 1970s than to the cutting-edge LEAP engines flying on the A320neo neo and 737 MAX. Put those pieces together and the C919's core problem comes into focus. It's heavier than its rival, it flies shorter, and it's powered by an engine deliberately held one generation back. You cannot copy your way out of that, because the thing China couldn't copy was never the shape of the aircraft. It was everything holding the aircraft up. Which leads to the number that quietly defines this entire story: production. Since assembly began, COMAC has built its C919s at a pace that would embarrass a boutique car maker, around 32 aircraft total by early 2026. It delivered roughly 15 in 2025, against an original target of 75. In the first quarter of 2026, just 3 left the line. For contrast, Boeing and Airbus each complete more than 1 aircraft a day. COMAC's order book runs past 1,000 frames. At current rates, clearing it would take deep into the 2030s, and possibly beyond. But the deeper vulnerability isn't speed, it's control, because a supply chain that depends on the West can be switched off by the West. In 2025, amid escalating trade tensions, the United States temporarily suspended export licenses for the LEAP-1C engine. COMAC's production lines went quiet. Some C919 airframes reportedly sat on the tarmac, complete, but for engines they could not legally receive. The licenses were eventually restored, but the message was unmistakable. China's flagship aircraft program could be grounded overnight by a decision made in Washington. China understands this. It is developing a domestic replacement engine, the CJ1000A, and its latest 5-year plan names that engine a national strategic priority, but turbofan development is measured in decades, not years. Realistic timelines put the CJ1000A into service around 2030 at the earliest. So until roughly the next decade, every C919 that rolls off the line does so at the pleasure of foreign governments, a national pride aircraft built to prove independence that cannot be finished without imported parts. And that is the pattern underneath everything. The C919 isn't one weak link. It's a chain of dependencies: engines, avionics, certification, support, each of which China has tried to copy, and none of which can be copied fast enough to matter. Which brings us to the obstacles that make the Western sale almost impossible. Here is where a fair analysis has to slow down, because the case against the C919 as a global aircraft is strong, but it deserves to be made precisely. Start with certification. The C919 holds a type certificate from China's own regulator, the CAAC. That's what lets it fly domestically. What it does not hold is approval from EASA or the FAA. This is not a formality. Without EASA approval, no European airline can operate the type, and the many countries that follow EASA's lead are closed too. Without the FAA, the United States is out. EASA test pilots did fly the aircraft in Shanghai in late 2025, which is real progress. But European officials have been blunt. Full certification is unlikely before 2028 and could slip as far as 2031. FAA approval isn't being actively pursued at all. Now follow what that does to the aircraft's economics, because this is the part airlines actually care about. Most of the world's commercial fleet isn't bought outright. It's leased, and leasing companies live and die on one number: residual value, what an aircraft is worth years from now when it comes off lease and needs a new operator. That number depends entirely on how many airlines in how many countries could take the aircraft next. An A320 can be released almost anywhere on Earth. A C919 locked out of Western markets effectively cannot. To an international lessor, its residual value outside China is close to zero. No secondary market, no redeployment. Buy one and you may be stuck with it. That single fact, more than any engineering spec, is what keeps Western airlines away. Then layer on the support gap. There is no global C919 spare parts network, no worldwide maintenance infrastructure. For an airline outside China, a C919 could face extended maintenance delays, sitting for weeks waiting on a component. In an industry running on razor-thin margins, that isn't an inconvenience, it's a business-ending risk, and the international orders that do exist tell their own story. The one confirmed foreign order comes from Gallop Air of Brunei, a startup backed by Chinese investors. When Ryanair's Michael O'Leary mused publicly that he'd consider a COMAC jet if it were priced priced low enough, analysts read it for exactly what it was: leverage against Boeing, not genuine intent. But the most damning evidence doesn't come from the West at all. It comes from inside China. Private Chinese carriers, the ones under the most political pressure to fly the national champion, have kept right on ordering Airbus A320neos by the dozen in multi-billion-dollar deals, buying Western aircraft over the jet built in their own country. When the airlines closest to the manufacturer choose the rival, that is the market delivering its verdict, not out of politics, out of arithmetic. So step back and ask the honest question: is the C919 a failure? Not exactly. That's too easy. And it's wrong. The aircraft flies. It carries real passengers on real routes every day. 3 of China's largest airlines operate it across dozens of domestic city pairs. National pride lifts off with every departure from Shanghai. For a country that 50 years ago was picking through a crashed 707 to learn how a jet was built, the C919 is a genuine achievement. But commercial aviation doesn't reward achievement. It rewards efficiency. It rewards reliability. It rewards the ruthless optimization of cost per seat, per kilometer, that decides whether an airline lives or dies. And measured on that scale, the only scale that matters to a buyer, the C919 is heavier, shorter ranged, slower to build, dependent on foreign parts, and locked out of every market that generates the most revenue. China set out to copy an aircraft, and it succeeded. It built something that looks like an A320, seats like an A320, flies like a lesser A320. But it could never copy the thing that makes the A320 valuable: the 40 years of flight data, the global web of spare parts and certified mechanics, the 2 regulators whose stamp opens the world, the trust of a lessor willing to finance it. You cannot reverse engineer an ecosystem. Boeing isn't going anywhere, neither is Airbus, and inside its vast protected home market, the C919 will almost certainly survive, subsidized, mandated, and flown for decades. But the assumption the whole world quietly accepted, that China would inevitably build the 3rd great aircraft manufacturer, that scale and money and patience would simply win, that assumption is looking far less certain than it did, because the question was never whether China could build a plane that looks like an A320. It clearly can. The question is whether it can build everything the A320 is not, and whether, by the time it does, the rest of the industry will still be standing still.